It's the Autosport podcast. We look back at Lewis Hamilton's crucial victory in the Mexican Grand Prix and dig into some of the stewards' decisions that shaped the race. So, a second consecutive victory for Lewis Hamilton in the Mexican Grand Prix ahead of Nico Rosberg as the World Championship heads towards its denouement in Abu Dhabi in a few weeks' time. My name is Edd Straw, the editor-in-chief of Autosport, and to look back on an eventful race, I'm joined here in Mexico City by F1 Racing Deputy Editor Stuart Codling, star of the famous How to Pack a Bag to Travel to a Grand Prix video on YouTube, who I believe is mid-packing as we speak.
Yeah, it is on my bed, leaves open like an open book, a story yet to be written. Actually, I'm beyond mid-packing. It is awaiting only the touchdown of my wash bag, and then we will be vamos al aeropuerto, as they say around here.
So we can put some real pressure on your packing if we overrun the running time on the podcast.
It's not just me, it's my wife you'll have to answer to.
That sounds very dangerous. I'm also joined by Karun Chandhok, who you might know from television and driving about a bit in racing cars. Karun, are you enjoying staying in the hotel that claims to have served the first sandwich in Mexico in 1910?
That is a brilliant stat. I mean, that almost eclipses the Tara Hawara from Chihuahua band that played yesterday. That was my favourite fun fact of the weekend. And that's absolutely true.
Really. The one thing that disappoints me about the floor we're on at the moment, because I think we should point out that we're actually in Ed's bedroom, and somewhat disappointingly when I walked in, Edd was not sort of dressed in a dressing gown like Noel Coward in The Italian Job. But
I'd just like to add I was wearing clothes though, so I think people might get the wrong idea.
But your floor here is tiled, whereas mine the humble third floor is carpeted, and it's actually eerily reminiscent of the hotel in The Shining.
Anyway, no, I've enjoyed my first time in Mexico. I mean, I don't think I have perhaps enjoyed it as much as I should have done because it's quite late in the season, and October has been a long month for us full-timers, unlike you two who rock up every once in a while. 5 long-haul races in 7 weeks has been a tough slog, so I think everyone's kind of ready to go home. But nevertheless, it's always nice to come to a new country.
Yeah, I know how you feel, having done the full season many times in my time. So, Lewis Hamilton victory, a pretty comfortable one, Karun.
Yeah, utterly dominant. I think he came here on a bit of a mission because last year, obviously, he got blitzed by Rosberg pretty much all weekend. And, you know, he'd mentally checked out. And I think he wanted to show that this isn't a weak track for him by any stretch of the imagination. I think to be ahead in qualifying all the way through. I mean, Rosberg dug it out at the end to get within 2.5 tenths, but that was his absolute limit. And Lewis actually had a bit more potential in hand, I think, if you look at his lap. So, you know, utterly dominant. And in the Grand Prix, just disappeared up the road. And, you know, I spoke to Pete Bonington afterwards, his race engineer, and he said, yep, we were just managing it. And I think if he wanted to, that gap could have gone up to sort of 15, 18 seconds, which is, you know, as dominant a performance as we've seen, I think, all season.
And it was all weekend long, wasn't it? Codders, obviously we went up to the turn 1, 2, 3 on Friday morning, and you could see the difference. Lewis was much more comfortable. Nico, he wasn't driving badly, but just a little bit less precise, and you just thought, yeah, this is going to be a Lewis weekend if it keeps going like this.
It was funny that, wasn't it? Turns 1, 2, 3 were very, very interesting for an observer to have a look at the different cars' performances, and certainly it gave you an insight into how difficult the Renaults are to drive. They looked like they were towing a caravan. But I was kind of wondering more about where Rosberg was at, Karun, because as we observed by watching that sequence of corners, and sort of I popped out for P3 and went down to 4, 5, 6 and then around to the S's, and it just seemed like Lewis was just that little bit quicker. Was that all we had to see from Rosberg this weekend?
Well, he put it all on the line, didn't he? That final run in Q3, and he still came out short. You know, by his own admission, Lewis was too strong for him in qualifying, and then come the Grand Prix. I mean, Lewis's only potential Achilles heel was going to be the start. But looking at what he did in Austin last week and you know what he did in Mexico, you'd have to say he's sort of getting the hang of that now. Once they got to turn 1 and he was through, sort of across the grass, but he will come back to that, I'm sure. But, you know, after that, it was kind of done and dusted. I think that the circuit is tricky here because of the high altitude. we're nearly 2,300 meters up. And it has a big effect in terms of braking stability because you've got less downforce. It's got a big effect in terms of actual aero grip. And to compound that, you've got a track surface, which is actually quite low grip. It's a very smooth surface. In FP1 and even FP2, it looked dreadful. Not a single car I watched, apart from maybe the Ferrari actually in P2 on the super soft tire. But there was nobody else that I watched and thought, wow, that looks hooked up. Everyone looked like they were really struggling. It started to come alive a little bit in qualifying, but I think the combination of those two things made it really tricky. And Lewis, we know when you get these conditions which are sort of less than optimal in terms of grip, he's got tremendous feel under braking. I don't think there's anyone in the history of Formula One who's ever had such good feel under braking. And those corners you just mentioned at the end of the two DRS zones, absolutely crucial for that.
Ed and I were saying, just to sort of elucidate further upon that point, that actually it's quite a good thing to have circuits like this, because if it was all high grip and high speed corners, which of course the drivers profess to love because they like going quickly, then they're not really exploring all the bits of their skill set, are they? So when you see corners like that, it's actually asking questions that a high grip circuit might not.
Yeah, I think the track layout, if it was actually at sea level, would be really good for overtaking. I think, again, because we're high up, the slipstream effect is much less than it would be. And therefore, I don't think we saw as much overtaking as I would have liked to have seen. I think they, even with DRS and the slipstream, the racing both last year and this year hasn't, it's not been brilliant, has it? When you look at the layout thinking, wow, it's over 1 kilometer straight line. Surely there's going to be some fantastic slipstreaming battles here. But then it just kind of doesn't happen.
Do you think that the tyres have got a role to play with that? Because in the post-race presser for the podium finishers, a local journalist asked the three finishers and the guy who then subsequently wasn't in third place anymore.
There were three third place finishers.
There were three third place finishers, yeah. He asked them what they would do to improve the circuit, and Lewis very diplomatically didn't criticise the circuit and said, actually probably quite presciently, that it would be better if Pirelli sort of shifted a range softer and brought the ultra soft, super soft, and soft. And Rob Smedley said in his press debrief afterwards pretty much the same. He would love to see that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, we don't like to see one-stop races, and you could see when you watch the Grand Prix unfold, there were a lot of drivers coming on the radio, not just on the TV broadcast that everybody saw, but on the pit lane channel that I listened to as well. There were so many people, drivers, coming up to their engineers going, do something, we have to do something, get me out of this, I'm stuck behind this train. But on a one-stop race, what could they do? They can't pit again, they can't go, they can't do anything. So I 100% agree. I mean, the medium tyre, the fact that Palmer did, 69 laps or something, that's wrong.
The whole race distance.
Yeah, I mean, that's wrong. We shouldn't see races like that. That wasn't ever the plan. And I 100% agree. They should have brought the ultra soft.
And obviously, talking about Lewis's excellent performance, the one problem was the first corner. Obviously, Karun, you've got a bit of experience of clattering across the grass. I used to see you in your early days in F3 and you did that a lot. But I just wanted to read this quote from Lewis after the race when he talked about brake temperature problems and brake glazing. He said, basically on the formation lap, I had a glazed front right brake. I couldn't wake it up, so I had 500C in the left front and 150 to 200C in the right front. Now, Nico Hülkenberg gave that short shrift. He said, well, if you had a glazed front brake there, that would be a problem for the rest of the race. He was one of the drivers, as was Rosberg, who wasn't delighted to see him not penalised. So what do you make of what Lewis has said and what happened?
Well, first of all, you can clean up disc glazing, because disc glazing is not a black and white thing. There's different degrees of having your brakes glazed. So they can clean up over a 5 to 8 lap period. It would have needed some hard, aggressive braking from him under the safety car. Perhaps we should explain to people what glazing means. What happens is you've got the carbon brakes, and if you don't get enough temperature in them, carbon brakes need to work at a minimum of 450 degrees. Anything above that is good. Anything below that is way below the threshold. And if he's talking 200, then it kind of gets this mirror shiny effect. and effectively the brake pad doesn't bite against the disc, so it just sort of just slips effectively on or slides on the top surface. But that can get cleaned up. A split of that degree, and if he's talking, just over 200 on the front brake disc, that's way below temperature. So I can understand why he ended up locking up and going straight. But I think Lewis got away with that. There was a lot of people calling for him to be penalised. But I think the fact that the race was basically neutralised in terms of the safety car coming out, I think negated any effect of him gaining an advantage.
Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at it, he did actually have quite a big lead after that, because there was a clear advantage. If you look at him, by the time he gets to turn 4, he's got a huge amount of clear space. Obviously, Verstappen and Rosberg had their wheel banging moment, so that would have cost them time anyway. But I think you're right, the virtual safety car period probably did kind of eliminate the need, perhaps, especially with the fact there was a mess going on behind. So we could have ended up with all sorts of penalties flying around, I guess.
There's kind of too many what ifs in a lot of those things that the stewards looked at this weekend, because to kind of look at where Lewis was after that incident, you have to look back and consider how much time Verstappen and Rosberg lost by banging wheels and Rosberg going over the grass as well. And later on, there were similar things where you kind of think, well...
I think in those instances where there is a question mark and a what if, they did the right thing, which is give the benefit of doubt to the driver, because it would have been completely wrong to penalise him for that, because it's like, as you say, what if these two hadn't hit each other, then they may have been in a slipstream down to turn 4, blah, blah, blah. There are too many questions. So I think it was right not to penalise him there.
It's almost the fault of the circuits, really, isn't it? Particularly that one, because obviously another what if there'd been a gravel trap there, Lewis would have locked up. He wouldn't have come off the brakes and rolled across the grass deliberately. He'd have had a bigger lock up. He was close to having to pit anyway with a flat spot, so surely if he tried to keep it on the track and got around the corner, he would have had to be in the pits at the end of the first lap, and he'd have been on a recovery drive from the back. So this is kind of a problem that's been going for years, really, hasn't it, with clear runoffs.
I never actually got a chance to ask Charlie about it, but I was a bit surprised not to see the speed bumps, for example, that they've used at the top of Les Combes at Spa, for example, where the drivers can't go across that flat out because they will damage the floor of the car. And it was quite a sensible solution, I thought, at Spa. And you could see anyone who, we saw quite a few drivers cut across the top. They did lose time, and they did perhaps lose a position. So a bit surprised they didn't choose to do that here. 100% agree. I'm not a fan of the tarmac runoffs at all. Never have been. I believe in real gravel and grass being the best solution, because you can't go flat out through that. You will damage the car. And I understand the reasons behind it. It's because of motorcycle racing and various other sort of safety concerns that certain people have researched. But it's almost created as many problems as it's solved. And I'm not going to go down that path, because that's a whole podcast on its own. Don't get me started.
3-part special coming this week.
Exactly.
I think we need to really have some perspective on this, in that one of the most pressing reasons for bringing in the tarmac runoffs came from above, and the short grey-haired Mr. Majika looked like, who presides over the sport, who was worried that if cars got beached in the gravel trap, there wouldn't be that many cars running at the end of the race, and it would ruin the show. So thither we got asphalt runoffs.
You say that though, Stuart, but I've been on the FIA Drivers Commission now for the last 3 or 4 years.
So we can blame you.
Yeah.
You're to blame.
No, we
Why don't you do anything?
Let me
Punish
finish.
him.
No, we're not letting anyone associated with officialdom finish.
No, I mean we obviously have meetings with the Safety Department and the Circuits Commission, just to be clear, that they're the ones responsible for it, and they genuinely believe this is, they've done a lot of research, and I won't bore you with the details, but they do present a lot of their research as to why this works. And as I say, there are probably most instances is because of a compromise that needs to be done with the FIM for the motorcycle guys. But I don't think that we really have seen the final solution. I think what we saw in Austria was actually quite good, although it damaged some suspensions and stuff. But it was a deterrent. It stopped people from using those big runoff areas that they have there. They couldn't go beyond a certain point of the curb. And then I think they sort of had these bolt-down curbs, which, because the MotoGP went to Austria 2 or 3 weeks later, and I noticed they lifted those, they sort of unbolted those curbs.
They can change the curbs because they change for DTM as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that is actually quite a clever solution, and it's something that, maybe needs to be looked at other circuits.
And obviously there was the other Turn 1 incident. Rosberg wheel banging with Verstappen, or vice versa, I should say. Obviously Verstappen had a brief lock-up. He was contesting for second place, pushed Rosberg a bit wide. They had their moment. Both survived it. Rosberg, I think, said he had a little bit of a steering offset for the rest of the race. What do we think of that? The stewards did have a brief look at it. No action.
You're talking about lap 1?
Yeah, lap 1.
I think it's just lap 1, turn 1, argy-bargy, to be honest. It's, it happens in Formula 4. It happens in any category. I think it's fine. We need to, we need to not nitpick at every single little bit of wheel banging. So I thought that was fine.
In the words of Jenson Button in the presser the other day, I concur.
Good. That's a useful quote to add to the mix. I think it's a good point when it comes to that kind of racing. I'm very wary about penalties being given based purely on outcomes. They should be the physics of the incident. But I always think when you get something like that one, or Rosberg on Raikkonen in Malaysia, where both kind of get away with it, that's when you have to say, yeah, okay, you sort of let that one slide. It's what people want to see, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's been various instances of inconsistency, I think, and that's, all three of us spoke to the drivers yesterday, various drivers, and everyone complained. I think it was pretty unanimous in that, the consistency of penalties this year has been questionable. I do understand from a steward standpoint, because I've had conversations with, Emanuele Pirro and Tom Christensen and Emerson Fittipaldi, these guys who have been in the stewards room, and it's a subjective thing. If the three of us looked at an incident, we'll probably have 3 different views on it. So as long as you have different stewards coming to every race, you are going to have inconsistencies. That's just human nature. That's just the way it goes. It's a subjective thing. So I think that process, for me, needs to be looked at, is how do we tighten that up? Because, you look at Austin, Ed, and the Alonso Massa incident where Fernando wasn't penalised. I don't see how that's different to what happened to Rosberg and Raikkonen in Malaysia.
Massa's quite a good example, actually. I spoke to Massa in Miami, funnily enough, about that incident, so we can have a bit of a listen to what he says about the incident before carrying on.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't blame him to try to overtake. I mean, he's at the end of the race. We are fighting there for the 5th place, which is really a great position for all of these 3 cars fighting there. But I mean, he was too far away. I mean, he just dived inside, and if I was not there, he couldn't make the corner. So he just managed to overtake because he hit me, and even hitting me, he went outside of the track. So it was too much. Even if maybe the camera from the top, it looks amazing. He tried to overtake, they touch. It's just nice. But I mean, he was far away. He just locking the wheels and just coming with the wheel lock and hit my car, which it was definitely too much. So, and then after that, he even overtakes Sainz, and he went completely offside of the track on braking, and it's fine. I think he had a very good friend in the stewards room this race, to be honest.
I mean, are you surprised that they didn't look at that? Is that going to change the way you approach the last few races in terms of track limits? If you can be quite so forceful and run off the track to carry more speed into corners, that kind of thing, surely you're going to take advantage of that?
I'm surprised because it's very inconsistent, the penalties, So that's, for me, for sure, what's happened to other cars, moving on braking. This is a different thing, but, it's a bit inconsistent. And that, for me, is not working really well. And I hope really they think about what to do, because otherwise they just make the drivers thinking that you can do everything you want.
And obviously that part of the circuit is quite difficult in the position you were in. You were chasing Sainz, you had Fernando behind you, and obviously the line kind of carries you wide, and it can open up quite a inviting door up the inside. So how difficult is it when you're in that situation in between 2 cars? Sainz had a lock-up, you're trying to get a good exit to get as close as him to possible, and you've got another car behind you. So do you just have to assume that when a car's that far behind, you're safe, you're not going to be attacked?
No, the thing is that when I go out of the corner before, I had quite a good gap. So that's why I tried to go on the better line is to brake completely on the right and then you turn. But he was not close. He was far away. And you can even watch in his inside camera. He was far away. And then I didn't believe he was trying that because he was not close to me, you know. So otherwise I would brake inside for sure if he was a little bit closer to me. So I never believed he was trying to pass me there. And he just passed me because he locks and he pushed me out. Otherwise he would never make the corner. You know, so that's a little bit different thing. For sure, maybe when you look from the top, it looks amazing. But then if you look and you pay attention, it's completely different than how it looks from the top.
Well, clearly Massa not particularly happy with that either. So, yeah, I think the process needs to be understood. And I do find it odd that in, a sport where the stakes are so high, we'll come down to the third place shambles at the end. But, the difference between having a car on the podium, not on the podium, there's a lot of money at stake, a lot of prize money at stake. And world championship points and things like that. And we've seen so many instances this year where the stewards have got involved. Hockenheim, I thought with Rosberg, I didn't think he deserved to be penalised there in that move with Verstappen. Austria, he got a nothing penalty, which I thought was wrong as well. So, I think there's been a lot of instances, and you almost think if you had 3 or 4, I don't know how many other stewards they need, guys who are nobody's going to volunteer to do 21 weekends. It's impossible. Nobody has that much time to spare. But if
apart from you, obviously,
no.
your capacity as a
You
broadcaster,
want to be paid to do it.
I don't know. I might put you forward because obviously you did bring us some coffees before this, so you're cheap and you're very willing to help.
Yeah. No, I think if they have 4 people who are permanently there, even if it's a wrong decision, it's at least the same wrong decision every time. So you get consistency. Then everybody knows what the lay of the land is. A pre-season test, Barcelona, you get Charlie, 4 stewards, all the 22 drivers, the 11 team managers. You have a big meeting at the pre-season test and say, right, boys, here's some videos of incidents that happened in the past. These, I think, are acceptable. These are unacceptable. Clean slate. Forget all the precedents. Forget everything that happened before. From the start of 2017, this is now what's acceptable and what's not.
There's also a question of the sort of the level of information available to the stewards and how you process that information in the stewards room when you're investigating, because they've got so many angles and replays that it can get a little bit forensic. And
very specialised data as well.
Yeah, so for instance, in the revolving door over third place, obviously Verstappen to Vettel revolving door was quite quick because it was a bit open and shut. And then the Vettel...
Can you open and shut a revolving door?
It depends. It's like a rotary engine valve.
Yeah, that's
isn't
what
it?
confused Bernie those years ago.
Spin the wheel of justice.
So is this that a revolving door is always either open or shut? Is it Schrodinger's revolving door?
I think it is Schrodinger's revolving door. You sort of once you're in, only when you're in it can you work out whether it's open or shut. But anyway, moving on. Otherwise, we'll just be revolving in this revolving door of Schrodinger-ation. I've almost lost what I was saying. Yes, Vettel and Ricciardo. To my mind, when I was watching that live, I just thought kind of racing incident. And I actually thought, haven't those 2 drivers done a damn good job of not actually hitting one another?
I thought Ricciardo did a blinding job. He's so good in wheel-to-wheel in terms of being right on the edge that he's a fantastic driver, isn't he? That ability to survive those things.
And then you look at that, what was it? So 4 o'clock, they had to report to the stewards. 10-6, the result was published. So that's a good hour and a half or more of forensically looking at replays, data, and that sort of thing. And it kind of reminded me of, sorry to bring the oval-shaped ball in, Ed, rugby, where you have the television match official, and every so often the ref stops the game, and there's this interminable process where you look at this incident replayed in slow motion. And sometimes a wise referee will say, can you stop showing me that in slow motion and replay it in real time? Because very often an incident looks worse in slow motion than it does when it's actually happening in real time.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to judge when you're not in the room, but Ed and I were talking about this in over the weekend, where I think back again to Austria, where Lewis and Nico hit each other. I think it was the last lap at turn 3. And that would have been at probably 3:45, in the afternoon. We got the result nearly at 7 o'clock or something. We nearly missed our flight. If that
I
had
hope
happened,
you took to Twitter to angrily declaim the world for that.
No, but it's what confused me was if that incident had happened on lap 2, they would have made the decision by lap 12 and given him his penalty during the Grand Prix. So that I think that comes back to your point, is that if something happens towards the end of the race, they end up with so much time to look and almost in some way overanalyze it. But I think I do disagree with you, though, on the Vettel-Ricciardo one, because when I saw it, the first thing I thought was this contradicts the bit of paperwork that came out on Thursday about moving under the braking zone.
Well, we can actually just, looking at what the stewards said in terms of the rules, let me just...
Ed's got all the information at his fingertips
no,
at
exactly,
all times.
although I'd scrolled down on the screen, so I got onto an irrelevant bit. So, yeah, the steward's note said, Article 27.5 and the race director's notes have essentially 3 criteria that determine a breach. Driving in a manner potentially dangerous, and a normal change of direction, and another driver having to take evasive action. And for me, it does tick those boxes. It was a late move. Ricciardo had to take evasive action. They were quite lucky not to have a collision. So in terms of this being a kind of official rule rather than an unwritten sort of gentleman's rule, if you like, as it was before, I think they had to penalise him. Otherwise, that whole rule change would have been completely debased.
It's highly ironical that effectively a rule driven by Verstappen's moves early in the year has ultimately benefited Red Bull at the first race that it's been brought in. It's
was it ironic or merely a happy coincidence that also Vettel, who's one of the chief moaners about other people moving under braking, I think Alanis Morissette needs to know whether that's ironic or just a coincidence.
Obviously, Vettel was not especially happy at that moment, so you can excuse him a little bit of fury. Obviously, if we look back just before that, when Vettel attacked Verstappen using the DRS going down to turn 1, Verstappen overcooks it on the brake, stayed ahead, cut the corner. He was initially told by the team, as we heard on the radio, to maybe cede the position. And then they apparently said, no, don't, we're having a look at it. And I suspect there was probably a strategic reason for that. And obviously he was stuck behind a car he felt he shouldn't have been behind. So he was on the radio saying, I'm being backed into Ricciardo now. This is ridiculous. So it wasn't the right thing to do, but you can understand why he was quite so furious. I know Vettel loves being furious in the car, but that was a situation I think any driver would have been livid about, and maybe that might cloud the judgment.
I think first of all we should clarify the Verstappen thing. They said on the radio, you may need to give that place back. What wasn't broadcast out to the world, and what his engineer Gianpiero Lambesi said to me was, Verstappen's reply was, okay, let me know. And then he said, keep going for the moment, and then nothing else. So, there were a lot of people on Twitter saying, the team told him to give the place back. That wasn't actually true. There was a conversation that carried on that wasn't put out to the world. I fully understand it. In the heat of battle, you do get frustrated. You do rant about other people, and it's completely illogical. I've done it loads of times where you rant about traffic, for example, in qualifying. And I'll never forget, I had an engineer in GP2, and I got held up on my quick lap, etc., etc. I was ranting down the radio, and eventually he got so fed up, he came back with, "What the beep do you want me to do about it?" And I was like, well, actually, that's actually true. So,
but it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because obviously we listen to these radio broadcasts and people make all sorts of judgments about it. I mean, Hülkenberg was saying after the race, obviously we're doing 300 plus kilometres an hour, right on the limit. Yeah. And sometimes drivers need to be able to vent, etc. You don't get... In a football match, you don't. Well, certainly not in some countries. They do it. They get lip readers and all sorts of things. But you don't get this kind of in-depth thing of everything a footballer says in anger. There's got to be, I guess, half the time it's a release, isn't it? Because if Vettel's angry about blue flags, he can just sort of vent on the radio, and that's that anger gone, and he can just get on with driving.
And they're not robots, are they? And it's only language that you would hear on the street.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have a problem with him showing emotion and frustration. There were 2 comments that we heard. I don't know the others that we didn't hear. There were 2 comments that we heard, which I thought were a bit over the line. One was calling Fernando Alonso an idiot in FP2, because really it's FP2. You don't get points, you don't get prizes. It doesn't matter. And Fernando Alonso is not an idiot. He's a double world champion who is arguably one of the best drivers of all time. The other one was having a pop at Charlie Whiting I thought that was a bit over the line.
It was a bit stupid as well. You want to be on side with the referee, so to speak.
Fill in the blanks as well. I noticed that one of the journalists in the post-race presser asked Sebastian to elucidate as to what he actually said, and he declined to define the term of Anglo-Saxon that he used. But I can imagine we all know what it was.
He has an excellent grasp of English. That's what comes from driving for certain British teams in his junior days.
And I mean, I think we have to keep in mind here who he is and what he's achieved. All those years, Lee Mackenzie put this to him, because all those years that he was winning the World Championship, he often talked about how he wants to be a role model for the next generation, a role model for kids. He's now a father, etc., etc. And so Lee put it to him, going, "Do you think that was fitting of a role of being a role model to the next generation?" And he did not like that. I think the interview is online. People can see it, but he was not happy. You could see his face. Shrift. You could see his face change, and he was furious. Sort of like, "What sort of a question is that?" And
also known as, you got me on that one.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's a funny one, that.
Well, he's just annoyed that he said something in the heat of the moment, and he's got to pay the consequences for it. But we do live largely in a world where our democratic rights to express our opinion, whether that opinion is right or wrong, it is enshrined in various constitutions. And if he wants to describe the race director in terms that rhyme with the surname of the 1976 world champion, for instance, then he is perfectly free to express that opinion, but he's going to have to pay the consequences afterwards, and he can't sort of switch his mouth from blow to suck and hoover those words back in.
Well, the world has changed, hasn't it? I was looking at a press conference, because obviously there's this big furore about Lewis in Suzuka, and I was looking at a press conference from the early 90s with Senna and Mansell, and Senna's come out of the race, won the Hungarian Grand Prix, and all he can do is complain about how bad the car and the engine are, etc., etc. That sort of stuff just doesn't happen these days. And, like it or not, the world has changed, and everyone's just gotten a bit more PC. So we do like to see characters. I think it's great to see emotion. It's great for the show. I spoke to Bernie afterwards. Unusually, he stayed till after the Grand Prix, and so I sort of popped into his office and had a bit of a chat, asked him what he thought of it all. And, he said it's great for the show. And he is right. We do need to keep all of that in mind for the show. But there is a line. As I say, there were two things that I had a problem with. The rest of it I thought was good for the show.
So just looking back through the incidents we've had in this race, obviously there were multiple stewards' decisions. We've got our little three-man steward panel here, including a former driver. No, sorry, you're not retired, including a driver.
But we're actually, by definition, an impermanent panel of three, because Karun and I are part of your rotating cast of special guests.
It's a revolving cast, yes. I'm just the chairman, as it were, so I get the casting vote. But turn one Hamilton at the start, we're happy with. Rosberg Verstappen, we're happy with. I think we're 2-1 in favour of the Vettel penalty. Verstappen cutting turn one, which he got the 5-second penalty that cost him what was initially third place over the line.
Tricky one for me. Once again, that was an incident to me where I couldn't tell whether or not he took an advantage from that.
I think he eliminated a disadvantage is the way I'd look at that one.
Oh, what a wonderful way of putting it.
I think Verstappen, and this is something Pirro said to me in Suzuka when he was Stuart, he said, Verstappen is incredibly intelligent. He understands the regulations, and he knows how to flirt with the edge of being legal without going over it. And, this is one of the problems with these runoff areas and sort of get out of jail cards you get at chicanes, is that if you as a driver, you're wheel to wheel with somebody, and if you think somebody's going to come down the inside, all you have to do is come off the brakes and go straight across. And then you can argue the toss later that I was in front going in and I'm in front coming out. I haven't gained an advantage. You kind of had, and I think the way you put it was right, is that you got away without a disadvantage of being overtaken. So, yeah, to me, that was a tricky one. And I think you'd need to really look at the data and see at what point he came off the brakes. Could he have made the corner, even if it meant losing a place? And if he could have made the corner, then he deserved the penalty.
Well, I think this is why you kind of need to eliminate that option with what we were talking about earlier, with treating the runoff in a way that either there's gravel or there's something that slows you down. But because obviously it becomes a bit of a zero risk thing for him, because he cuts across, he gets a 5-second penalty later. It doesn't really cost him anything.
To me, he should have just given the place back there and then had another go, over the next straight or something. I mean, his tyres were shot by that point. But if you're asking me for a firm view, I would say he should have given the place back then and there.
I'd agree with that. I think it's the logical thing to do.
I think we have unanimity in our 3-man panel here.
Excellent. And obviously the other incident, which was a spectacular one on the first lap, was when Sainz moved over on Alonso. And I remember you watched the field coming down to turn 4, and I remember seeing a car sideways on the grass and just saying, "Oh, there's going to be a big one there." Fortunately, it was Fernando Alonso, so he was if anyone was going to gather it up, it was going to be him. But obviously, Sainz was annoyed about that penalty because he was sort of well ahead. He said he didn't really see Alonso. Fernando did have a bit of an overlap, and there was nothing he could have done about it. So again, that one I'm inclined to think is a fair one because he was forced off the track. And again, we have now got this sliding scale of penalties. You can have a 5-second penalty, you can have a 10-second penalty, you can have a drive-through. Stop-go, I think, still exists, but I don't know what you'd have to do to get a stop-go these days.
He may not have been able to see Fernando in his mirrors, but I'm sure, and Karun will correct me if I'm wrong, at that point in a race on the first lap, in a corner like that, you're kind of going to know that there might be someone there. And he closed the door pretty decisively and invited the person behind him in that position to back off. Unfortunately, the person in that position was double world champion Fernando Alonso, who's not a man to back off, but fortunately, as you said, has the skills to gather up the ensuing tank slapper.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but he got that 5 seconds added at the end of the race, didn't he? He didn't serve it. He didn't have to do it at the pit stop because they awarded it. Yeah. I think they awarded it a lap after the pit stop, basically. But
so in a one-stop race, that penalty system doesn't work well.
Do you not think? I mean, first of all, I do agree with the penalty. But secondly, do you guys not think that in itself is flawed? Because if you have to serve a 5-second penalty on lap 14 of the Grand Prix, you will drop behind in terms of track position and get stuck behind slower cars. In which case, you will lose much more than 5 seconds. Whereas if you get awarded the 5-second penalty, added to your time at the end of the Grand Prix, you'll only lose the 5 seconds. You're not losing getting stuck potentially behind a Toro Rosso or behind a Renault or a Manor or a Sauber who's slower than you.
You're also interfering with the race more because you've got someone ahead of you you're battling with. They're not really there, if you like, but of course they are still getting in your way, holding you up, causing you to overweight your tyres.
Yeah, I mean, the more I've thought about it this year, the more I think they need to be a little more universal in how they award this 5-second penalty. Because doing it, especially if you got a race with multiple pit stops, where if you got a 2-stop or a 3-stop race, where it's so crucial to hammer through traffic and get through quickly, and track position is so important. If you get a penalty at your first pit stop, it's just ruined your entire afternoon. Whereas in theory, if you're only trying to award a 5-second penalty, just make it universally done at the end of the Grand Prix.
I'd like to see that because it also it interferes more with the race, and it becomes, as you say, more than a 5-second penalty, doesn't it?
But of course, the counter argument is that people like to see the impact of the penalty as early as possible, and like you say, in a normal race with 2-3 pit stops, that penalty would have been served earlier. So I guess that's the counter argument. I basically agree with the idea that you want to kind of even up the advantage, the disadvantage, and minimise the disruptive influence the driver, who is an illusion, if you like, can have on the race. But at the same time, there's also this push to change as little as possible after the race.
Well, no, you announce it. You announce it on lap 3. If a guy's done something on lap 1, you announce if he's done a jump start, right? You announce it on lap 3 or lap 4 that he's got a 5-second penalty. So everybody knows, we're broadcasting to the world, and you guys are, updating the world on your websites and all sorts. But everybody knows that when the guy crosses the checkered flag, 5 seconds are added straight away. I don't have a problem with that. I think it's, as long as everybody knows, and we then have an hour or whatever to explain to the world that this guy's going to have 5 seconds added, keep it in mind. I think that's fine. Formula One is a complex sport. People watching, they're not stupid people. They do understand that this is a complex sport, which everything's not out there. And adding 5 seconds is much less complicated than trying to understand tyre strategies.
Better for the people watching at home and at the track if it's all determined there and then, because no one likes to have it the result pulled 2, 3, 4 hours after the fact, do they?
Hang on, you've just contradicted yourself then. So do you want this 5 seconds added at the end or not?
I want it added at the end. I didn't contradict myself at all.
You mean like with the Verstappen thing, that the cross the line, then the timing screen
cross
changes.
the line, then
Right,
gone.
okay.
Timing screen changes.
Instantaneously. I mean,
Not sort of.
Not an hour later.
You go. You've watched Sebastian Vettel wave and cheer and not drink sparkling wine from his shoe, and then you go off and do whatever else you're going to do on a Sunday afternoon, and then you switch the news on later, and in a darkened room, some people have changed the result.
Yeah,
it's just irritating, really.
Yep.
so are we fairly happy with the way 3rd, 4th and 5th shook out? Obviously in the end it was Verstappen was 3rd across the line, then Vettel was 3rd, and then Ricciardo moved up. So we had Ricciardo 3rd, Verstappen 4th, Vettel 5th. It was justice served across those?
I think all 3 of those had great Grand Prix. It's a shame it worked out how it did, but you wouldn't look at Ricciardo and say he didn't deserve to get 3rd place. He really made that strategy work.
Especially after that, the first lap stop made life quite difficult for him, and then they did the second stop and he charged through.
Yeah, I don't know if he would have passed Verstappen, so I'm not convinced that second stop did anything for him. They were 3rd, 4th before the stop, and he kind of ended up where
it just made the race harder for him.
It made the race harder. It made it more exciting to watch, but I don't think the 2-stop strategy was the thing to do.
Well, it certainly wasn't for Kimi Räikkönen, who made that second stop on lap 45 for no obvious reason, solely as far as I could see to give up track position to Nico Hülkenberg.
It was just,
and then of course,
it was inexplicable.
Well, you saw how close. He could have ended up getting stuck behind Nico, who was struggling on 3 million-year-old tyres, having stopped, I think, on lap 14. But obviously, Hülkenberg spun, trying to hang on alongside him. Could easily have backed into Räikkönen, and both of them would have been out, or the Ferrari was out, and he could have stayed out, held track position, and he'd been fine.
That situation comes back to not something that happened on Sunday afternoon, Ed. That comes back to what happened 14 weeks ago when they chose their tyres. Because Raikkonen and Ferrari chose only 2 sets of mediums for him coming into the weekend. And therefore, the first time he really got a reading on the medium tyres on the long run was in the Grand Prix. I think he did a little bit in free practice, but not enough. And and he said, I wasn't happy, so we thought we'll put another new set on and see if it was better, and it really wasn't. So,
but isn't that just Ferrari all over? You can extrapolate these things, can't you? And it always seems to be that Ferrari, Australia was another case in point, wasn't it? They said, we didn't really know about these tyres.
Yeah, I mean, they've done. I was going to say I was talking to people from Mercedes about this in Suzuka, I think, talking about tyre allocations and how difficult it is to do. And in fact, Tom McCulloch, who's the chief engineer at Force India, and he was sort of explaining the complexities of it. And he says, the one thing you have to understand with the Pirelli tyres is they're highly temperamental when it comes to getting it in the window in terms of temperature. The track, the asphalt, the temperature, and the lateral loads all play a huge factor. And nobody on this grid can say they conclusively know what tyre to use when. So therefore, the right thing to do is to give yourself options. And we've seen on more than one occasion Ferrari have come with 1 set of mediums, for example, or 1 set of of a particular compound. And you think, well, you've sort of snookered yourself here, because if all of these factors come together and mean that tyre is the one to have on Sunday, you might have to put it on in the Grand Prix without having run it at all in terms of getting information of free practice. And he's like, why do you snooker yourself? And I think Mercedes particularly are very good at making sure they've got enough of all of the tyres to use through the Grand Prix. They never get to a situation where on either car they've thought, we haven't got enough tyres. I think Force India actually, that's been one of their strengths, I think, is they've done really well in terms of giving themselves options.
Tom McCulloch's a really smart bloke, isn't he? He's very good to speak to, and you often, at the end of your conversation, you realise how little you actually know about the inner workings of Formula One.
Well, did you know that he and Pete Bonington, Lewis's engineer, were roommates at university?
Roommate? Do people still share rooms at university these days?
Apparently so.
Extraordinary.
The shock at that, given that we're recording this podcast not in a swanky studio but in my hotel room in Mexico City, perhaps says that strange things do go on in hotel rooms.
You do have room for a roommate here because there are 2 beds, which is
absolutely. It means
quite strange.
I can do a one-stop strategy, sort of change once in the middle of the night, or you can do 2. It works well. Then looking behind, obviously we had Raikkonen 6th, Hülkenberg 7th, then we had the 2 Williamses, Bottas, Massa, and then Sergio Perez in 10th in the Force India, who spent most of the race staring at the back of Massa, not being able to pass him.
And getting furious about it.
Exactly. But that's a very good day for Force India, considering this was probably the track that Williams would have expected to have the best advantage of the last 3. They're quite confident about Abu Dhabi as well, but it looks like this 4th place in the constructors' battle is going to Force India, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, since mid-season they've had the stronger car. You know, they deserve to be there. They've had the faster car, and I think if you look at Hülkenberg's season, he's been a bit unlucky. He had first lap incidents in Sochi, in Austin, and Singapore. Yeah, Singapore off the line, wasn't it? So he's had 3 first lap incidents where points were sort of lost. I think they deserve to be where they are in the Constructors' Championship.
They've got quite a mature technical package, both teams, haven't they? Because both the cars have a very strong familial resemblance with the cars they raced last year. It just seems to be that Force India have a better read on how their car behaves, whereas Williams haven't really... Felipe said that they've had the same car for months now and they haven't had much in the way of meaningful updates. And it just seems that Williams are still learning about the car and learning about the tyres and coming to the end of a Grand Prix weekend saying, all right, well, now we've actually learned how the tyres behave, we'll be better at this circuit next year. A bit late for that.
No, I think a lot of it comes down to aero, doesn't it? When you look at the races where Force India have, heavily outperformed Williams, they're the circuits with higher downforce requirements.
That's been a limiting factor at Williams for a while, isn't it? It's always difficult from the outside to be sure, but you kind of look at it and you think, well, there's consistently a kind of weakness there, where it's as soon as you start exploring these really complex areas, it's like they get to 95% of the potential. But then aero development now, 3 years into these aero rules, it's all about little, really tiny changes and tiny
That's
flicks.
right, and I think what's happened is as the power units have sort of started to equalise, Williams gained massively in 2014 and the beginning of 15 when the Mercedes was clearly ahead. But now that the Ferrari power unit and the Renault have started to come closer, when they don't hook up a weekend in terms of getting the ultimate result, they run the risk of being behind Toro Rosso or even McLaren or occasionally Haas earlier in the year, and all of a sudden they've lost points then to Force India, whereas Force India have somehow managed to stay ahead of that sort of midfield pack.
It's a little bit like, was it 2011, 2012 when they junked the Cosworth in favour of the Renault and got an instant performance boost, and everyone said, yes, Williams is back. But then as soon as aero development kicked in and the Coanda exhausts particularly, they slumped again. And when Pat Simmons arrived as their chief technical officer, he realised that they had no idea how this Coanda system was working, and the first thing he would say, take it off, you don't know how it works.
Yeah, that was when in 2013, wasn't it, when Bottas actually got some points in Austin. That was when they'd taken off the Coanda exhaust and the performance was transformed, which is extraordinary. Looking further down, any other standout performances? Marcus Ericsson 11th.
Brilliant.
That was pretty impressive. He's an interesting driver because I think people had kind of written him off as a pay driver. Obviously, he is bringing money, but Ericsson historically, pace hasn't really been his problem. Stringing everything together has been a bit of a problem, but he seems to be building up some nice momentum with Sauber now.
Yeah, I think the last 3 or 4 races in particular, he's actually done a really good job, and I think he's one of the key players in this sort of back end of the grid driver market, isn't he? Because as you say, he's doing a good job and he's got a bit of budget. So, you've got him, Nasser, Magnussen, Palmer, Gutierrez, and the 2 Manor seats, isn't it? So there's still actually 7 sort of undecided seats in that mid to back of the grid,
and a lot of them seem to be kind of looking around, waiting to see what happens. I spoke to Gunther Steiner, team principal of Haas last night, and he was saying, well, something's got to happen because obviously they're waiting, to see what else happens with sort
I
of
found
Force
it,
India,
I
those
found
kind
it
of days.
bizarre that there was a statement from Magnussen about an offer from Haas. That's not. I found that really odd
a bit
to
silly
be saying that
season,
in
wasn't
public.
it?
Yeah.
That's sort of trying to force the issue, maybe.
Well, we'll see. It's almost like a big game of Kaplunk, isn't it? Someone's waiting for the final straw, as it were, Ed. That's my worst joke of the weekend, I think.
I think the Force India seat is a key one, though, isn't it? Because that is the most competitive seat that is still available. So I think once that seat resolves itself, ultimately, drivers are all chasing the most competitive car they can get, and that's why you have to go through the market. You look at which is the World Championship winning team. That's settled. Then you look at the next one and the next one, the next one.
Basically, Force India and Renault are the two seats you'd be wanting currently.
Yes, they're the most competitive ones at the moment.
The weird thing with Ericsson is, though, he's kind of stuck where he is because if you do as I did and spend a lot of time looking through companies' house records, you find that basically here the people who are involved in his management and sponsorship backing are also that they either are the people who are now the majority owners of the Sauber team or are closely linked to them. So why would he want to move if his backers own that team?
No, I did have a conversation with him about it because he was on my flight between Austin and here, and it sounds like it's actually two separate deals in that. Yes, I think they do own the team, the majority share now, but they could potentially sponsor him as an independent deal to go to a team if there's a seat available higher up the grid.
And there's certainly some talks going on. So I agree that seems the most logical thing to happen. But
if this is Formula One, there's no logic in it.
Exactly. But if you're Marcus Ericsson, you can get into a Force India, then you and your backers probably think, I'd rather have that than a Sauber with a year-old engine next year.
And he's certainly been really impressive in the last few Grand Prix, maximising the potential. But I thought Jolyon Palmer did a decent job in a car that was pretty ropey.
It was horrible, wasn't it? I remember when we were watching trackside, it couldn't get the nose in and the rear wallows. It's just horrible.
And out of 6, they were a good 10 metres later than everyone else on the throttle because it was just so unstable.
And certainly Magnussen seemed to be struggling with the tyre, so he did a couple of stops, couldn't get any of his sets.
Yeah, Palmer 14 seconds ahead of Magnussen at the end, so that's good performance from the back of the grid, bearing in mind he didn't qualify. What about Haas? That was a really odd weekend. They really struggled.
They seem to have no idea what they were doing. I asked many people there this, and no one really gave a clear answer. I just wonder whether the unusual conditions, obviously the altitude, so you got less dense air, the weird track surface. We had some interesting track temperature variation. It's almost hitting all those sweet spots for an inexperienced team to mess up. Obviously, Grosjean changed his floor to an older spec after qualifying. He said the car was just unbalanced all over the place.
We had the brake ducts as well, which was interesting to speak to Roman about that after the session where they decided to take those off, and he was almost triumphant. He had this sort of note of "I told you so" in his voice because they were the ducts that had been used in China where he had an absolute dog of a race as well.
But this is, I think Haas they'll learn from this. They just have to put this down as a weekend where they didn't get the best out of the package. It wasn't long ago there were cars in Q3 at Suzuka. So I feel that's been the story of the season for Haas. They've done a fantastic job for their first year.
Yep.
Yes, they've got loads of stuff from Ferrari to help them, but obviously the thing that they can't shortcut is building that experience. There's good people there, but as a team, the knowledge, the understanding, they've not always got the best out of the car. In fact, more often than not, you probably argue they haven't. But there are always going to be weekends like this one.
To me, the most worrying factor, if I was Gunther Steiner or Ayo Komatsu, anyone at Haas, would be trying to draw a line across the season and trying to understand why they were fast. Because to understand why you're slow, you also need to understand why you're fast. And I think it's very easy when you've had a good weekend to just sort of strut the strut and say, "Oh, we've had a great weekend." But you do need to understand what circumstances led to that. And there are 3 weekends that stand out, don't they? Bahrain, particularly in Suzuka, and arguably Melbourne, because the race pace in Melbourne was very good. So, why could they be competitive there and then it hasn't happened elsewhere? And I don't think they actually know the answers. When we went to Baku, I went on a track walk with Roman, And when we were going around, he said, we're going to be good here because we need higher temperatures. Higher temperatures are exactly what we need. Last few races, Canada, etc., being too cold for us. And then they were rubbish in Baku. And then I saw him on Saturday evening. I said, what happened then? He said, I don't know. And
just goes to show
really
that Formula One's not a binary, linear business, is it?
Yeah, but you do need to understand it. And I know, speaking to people like Paddy Lowe, that they spend, a lot of time understanding, even at the level they're at, the dominance they've had, on a weekend where, say, a Red Bull or Ferrari get close to them, they spend a lot of time trying to understand why that particular circuit, those chasing teams were closer to them. And they do try and, get conclusive results with a lot of analysis. And perhaps that's the difference between a big team and a smaller team. They've got more people, more resources. You can allocate more people into the performance department in terms of analysis. So maybe there's an element of that.
It's one of the things that Gary Anderson, the former Jordan technical director, who's our technical expert at Autosport, often says, that nobody knows 100% of what makes their car work or not work. The best teams know close to that, but there's always little areas where something changes and the performance sensitivities throw it into an area where it exposes a weakness. But you feel that kind of Haas is in that area where it's got the least understanding of what's working, what's not working, than anyone else. So it's just about that knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, next year will be a massive challenge, and I'm really interested to see where they build from this year. I remember Jackie Stewart saying the second season is always the hardest one because, in year one they've had a year of build-up of no track activity. Now all of a sudden they're splitting resource between running on track and then building a car for the biggest regulation change that we've seen in a very long time, and it's going to be a big challenge for them.
And so looking back up at the front, we've now got 2 races to go, Brazil and Abu Dhabi. Rosberg's got a 19-point lead. He can still afford to finish behind Hamilton. In fact, he could drop to third in one of those races and still win it, but Hamilton's on a roll. Now he's got those 2 wins, so how do we see it going?
Well, first of all, if Rosberg wins in Brazil, he will be world champion. So, to me, that's the first standout statement going into the last 2 races.
He's going to want to do that so much, isn't he?
Absolutely.
That would answer so many questions.
Well, you won't. No one wants to be world champion by finishing second, do they?
I'll take it. I'm imagining Karun would have done.
Yeah, no, I mean, you'll take it rather than not, but you'd also rather get it done and dusted because, it's only 2 years ago Rosberg went to Abu Dhabi with the admittedly outside chance of being world champion, and then he had that problem with the power unit, didn't he? And he just sort of drove around slowly.
And then double points made it a massive gap at the end, didn't it?
Yeah. So,
but to his credit, he said, "I want to get this car to the end of the race."
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a pointless exercise, but he was never what was going to happen. He was never going to beat Lewis on points. But I think that will be in the back of his mind. So he will go to Brazil with the clear aim of trying to beat Hamilton and becoming world champion,
which in itself could be dangerous because he's got that position where he can just take it easy. If he does a par job the next 2 weeks and nothing goes wrong mechanically, then he is world champion. So The temptation would be strategically, you'd say, well, just do a solid job.
Historically, since 1990, when we've gone back to this configuration of the Sao Paulo circuit, I think it's got to be the most dramatic Grand Prix venue we've seen, isn't it? In terms of just sheer drama and unpredictable results and stuff going on.
Remember in the 2012 finale when Vettel turned in on Bruno Senna, spun, got collected, and I remember Vettel was at the Autosport Awards not many days after, and I remember chatting to him there and him just saying, as soon as he was hit, he thought there was no chance. He just sort of carried on. He said, well, I got the car pointing in the right direction. I'm going to try just in case. It was probably the mindset. It was a bit like Rosberg at Abu Dhabi. It's like, well, I'm not giving up. And obviously it happened to stay on board. But that tells you how fine the margins can be. You can have rain there, all sorts of things. So it's
look
almost
at 2008.
the worst.
I mean, 2008 was arguably the best championship conclusion in F1 history.
Yeah, my hands were shaking after that.
Well, and that was because McLaren played it too conservatively in that race. They put themselves on the bubble, and it was unbelievable. I for a feature for Autosport, I happened to be in the garage for the closing stages of that race, which made an unbelievable story. And just these ebbs and flows, the late pit stops, passed by Vettel and passing Glock on the slicks. So it shows how difficult it is because you can, on the one hand, you say, well, be conservative, but then if you're conservative, you don't give yourself a cushion. But if you go aggressive and try to give yourself more of a cushion or force the issue, then you run the risk of making mistakes. And Rosberg will be thinking about this. He'll try not to, but this will be in his mind all the time. And that's when things start to go wrong, when you start thinking, oh, should I be doing that, rather than just doing your job.
And there's always a risk of rain as well, isn't it? There's always, at this time of the year in Sao Paulo, there's always a risk of rain. And sometimes you get the complete deluge like we've seen, in the past. But sometimes you just get that little drizzle and that sprinkling of rain where you, like 2008, where it's like, oh, do we go slicks? Do we stay on intermediates? What do you do? And, I think it'll be great for Formula One to get a race like that. I think it'll be, you'll get a lot of drama. And then you've got the hard chargers like Ricciardo, Verstappen. You got a frustrated Sebastian Vettel who hasn't won a race in a long time.
The fact that we're all screwing our eyes up and raking our memories here at 7:30 in the morning to think of when it was just goes to show how long ago it was.
So, he's going to be after a result, and they've got nothing to lose. They've got absolutely nothing to lose.
It's the people who've got nothing to lose are the people you have to be the most scared of when you're trying to nail a world championship down.
And there's often a lot of, not necessarily desperate people, but there's a lot of people at the end of the season who, don't have anything to play for. They've got a few things to prove, or they're just frustrated and they think, let's just go all out for this. And they know, if you're sat behind Rosberg, let's say Rosberg's running second and you're Max Verstappen, and you think, I fancy a bit of second place. You know that Rosberg knows he can afford to slip to third, but that he won't want to. So you're just sort of thinking, well, he's going to be second guessing himself. Is he just going to let me through? And then the driver gets in two minds and you think, well, there we go. And Nico's not the best in wheel-to-wheel combat. The last thing he needs is other factors complicating the mindset.
Personally, I'd like to see, Lewis win in Brazil, Nico finish, fourth or fifth or something.
Set up a winner takes all.
Set up a winner takes all. You want to see a winner takes all Abu Dhabi weekend. It'll be great for the show. It'll be great for Formula One. And then whoever wins that in Abu Dhabi, whether it's Nico or whether it's Lewis, will be a deserving world champion. I'm not saying if Nico wins in Brazil, he will be undeserving. Absolutely not. The man, would have won 10 Grand Prix if he won in Brazil. So, but I think a winner takes all is just great for Formula One.
Well, there's lots to look forward to in Brazil in just under 2 weeks' time with the penultimate episode in the battle for the World Championship. So thanks very much to Stuart Codling of F1 Racing, who will be getting back to completing his packing, and Karun Chandhok, who I think will be exploring the world famous sandwiches perhaps before flying a little bit later on. Check out autosport.com for all the latest news and updates from the world of Formula One, and Autosport magazine out on Thursday, which will have an in-depth report on all the goings on in Mexico. We'll be back next week with another Autosport podcast. Music is 6am by Trilo, written by Marcus Simmons. See soundcloud.com/Trilo Music.